Hello there, and welcome back to another Lingua Carpa video. Today we're talking about your language diet. It's all about customizing and maximizing your learning because the language diet that you have, the things that you consume, the things you spend your time on during your language practice or language study time, that has to differ from person to person because of different levels, different priorities, different goals, things like that. This video will be applicable to language learners of any level. So let's customize your learning, maximize your learning so that you get the most benefit, the most bang for your buck, and you get the most out of the time that you spend on language learning. All right, your language diet. First part, welcome. Next, we will talk very briefly about a dream scenario. What if you could have everything work out for you? What if you had all of the right factors in place? What would that look like? And then how can we get most learners close to that? What are all the things that we can control, that we can do to make the best of our language learning, regardless of where exactly we are? After that, we will have to dive into the core principles that you must guide your own language learning and your language diet with. When you use these principles correctly, the rest of your learning sort of falls into place. On the flip side of that coin is if you don't use these, you're likely to spend a lot of time on things that probably aren't really worth your time. So we'll talk briefly on acquisition and on communicative learning and on comprehensible input. After that, we'll talk input. So strategies and fluency around input. Input is the reading and listening parts of language. And we will see some example materials, things that you could use for both of those that I think would be good. After that, we'll do output, strategies and fluency as well. Output, as opposed to input, of course, is the writing and speaking part of language. And we will discuss some example practice opportunities for writing and speaking. Finally, we will discuss how to prioritize and spend your study time, how much time to spend on one thing versus another, why, and how you can adjust that for your own goals. This last section is very dependent on your level, your proficiency level, and your goals. So the dream scenario, a dream scenario, if you could have it just right, everything in place, the perfect environment from a language learning perspective, first of all, you would already live somewhere where your target language is the main language. So if you could go live or go to school or go to live and work in the target language, I'm assuming you're not a complete beginner anyway, it's probably not best then, but then that would be the first thing. And ideally on top of that, you would also have a tutor or a teacher or a lot of people that you know well and talk to regularly within that target language. Also, you would have all of the other day-to-day interactions that a normal citizen would have in that language. Ideally, you would have an abundance of appropriate reading resources. Like I'm talking graded readers from level 0 in a language when you know actually nothing, all the way up to native level resources, but everything in between on every topic imaginable, right? Having it all, that's very difficult to do. You'd have an abundance of appropriate listening resources as well, kind of the same thing. What if you had an easy searchable catalog of every possible topic at every possible proficiency level? What a dream that would be. And an abundance of time. We'll just pretend that you are a hyper wealthy trust fund baby and you will never have to work any day of your life and all you do is sit around and learn language all day. But since most of this is not attainable for most people, we are going to zero in on what is accessible for most people and the factors we can control to maximize what you need. So let's get a bit more realistic and look at the core principles. First, acquisition and communicative learning. So acquisition versus learning, I talked about in a previous video, and also there's a lot of people all over YouTube that have already covered this. I don't need to go into it a lot. If we need a basic breakdown, here it is again. When you're acquiring a language, sort of the natural way of intaking and being able to become a speaker and user of a language, you are doing that through communicating, through interacting in the language, through making meaning out of the language and in the language. That is sort of like learning to ride a bike by practicing riding the bike. This is as opposed to learning a language, where it's an object of study. You're not really communicating, you're just studying the language itself directly, the grammar of it directly. And it would be like learning to ride a bike by me telling you what a bike is and how it works, but you don't actually get to sit on it or practice doing it, and then you are expected to be able to ride it. So we want to acquire the language through understanding real world communication. Think of a scenario like I need to go to a bakery and I need to ask for a specific item, a number of those items. I need to ask how much it costs, and I need to, say hello, say please and thank you. That's real communication. The communication there is the means to the end. The end is I want to buy bread because yum, yum. I love bread. But the language there is the tool. And that's what language is really for. It's for communicating. So it is not, as we just looked at briefly, it is not learning by being told what means what in your native language. So that would be like me saying, hi class, today we are going to learn animals in Spanish. Instead of me telling you a story or us reading a children's book in Spanish, I would say dog is perro and cat is gato. We would just go down the list of basically me telling you in English what that thing is in the target language. That's not acquisition, that's just translation. So you do not want to always use your native language as an analog. If all you did to learn a language was translate everything and learn grammar rules of that new language, but in your native language, then you're always using your native language as an analog. If I did that, anytime I need to say something in Spanish, I would need to think of the English sentence first, and then one by one, think about the translation for each of those words, and then apply the grammar rules one at a time until I finally have reorganized and fixed and hopefully correctly formulated the sentence. But also, it would take forever. It's not an effective way to learn a language. So the other principle is comprehensible input. Probably heard of this by now, and if you haven't, I'm going to keep it simple because this is something that has also been covered all over the internet a million times. I don't need to go through this in full again. Comprehensible input was initially posited by Stephen Krashen by saying that we learn language when we understand messages. If you want to know more about that term, go look it up. There's plenty of videos explaining it. When we make meaning out of real interactions, that's when we're going to learn things. The other piece of comprehensible input that we must know about is the +1. +1 means most of the things that I'm talking about, let's say on a topic, I know, but there's maybe that one thing just out of my reach that I don't know. Well, when I know the rest of it and we just +1 that, one little piece of new information, it's easier for us to figure it out by context. It's just a tiny bit beyond our level, but that sort of makes it accessible. And that way we +1 and we climb up to the new level. And that happens again and again when you have excellent input. So these principles, acquisition as opposed to learning, using communicative language practice, which is probably how I should have written it on the slide, as well as comprehensible input, these principles will leverage natural language abilities so that you can learn using the innate abilities of your human brain. We are communicators. Language is one of the incredible things that humans do, and we do it in so many fascinating and intricate ways, but almost all of that happens without conscious knowledge. And that's what's so crazy and impressive about it. So speaking of those principles, and especially speaking of comprehensible input, let's talk input. Reading and listening are the large majority of anybody's language diet. Why that as opposed to writing and speaking? Because first of all, you are always going to read and hear things more often than you will be able to produce. Think of everything, whether it's you sitting down to read a book or it's you being in the car and seeing an ad nearby or seeing an ad in a shop window, or you hearing a conversation that you're in, but you overhearing somebody else's conversation, you hearing a TV, you listening to a song, you watching a movie, you hearing things in the background. The magnitude of things that you read and hear compared to the amount of things that you will ever be able to write or say in your life, you will read and listen to exponentially more things. So it is natural that these are the center of the diet. So this next part's super important, especially when we're talking about things being comprehensible and keeping in mind that +1 principle of comprehensible input. And we have to have good materials for effective acquisition to happen. Here's your criteria for good materials. They have to be, especially as a beginner, that you have to have something you're interested in, and it has to be something you can understand in a meaningful way. If communication is not possible because something is so complicated, you will not be making meaning out of it. You will not be understanding messages, and therefore you really probably aren't acquiring anything because it's too complicated. So we need good materials and we need a lot of them. Let's break down reading and listening. For reading, there's a very interesting thing I think all students should be aware of here, and that is the first step of reading is learning to read. When you start a new language, especially if it's a language that has not used the same writing system as your native language, you really have to learn to read. You have to spend considerable time doing that. You have to learn to read first, learn the phonetic system, learn some alphabet or symbols or characters, whatever that might be. And then you have to go increasing your reading fluency and proficiency by, well, basically practicing reading a lot, reading silently, reading out loud, and building up to a level where you can read well enough that you can begin to read to learn. There's this switch we're looking at here between learning to read and reading to learn. At the beginning, you have to build this skill, and then you're able to leverage that skill of reading to learn new things. This is crucial. How do we build reading well? We always follow the principles from before, and then you read a lot and you read often, you will naturally increase in level and be able to build up over time. So while you're reading, should you stop and look things up or translate passages? You can do this sometimes. You should not do it all the time. And if you do it at all, it should be minimally disruptive of your actual reading. If something is right on your level, you should be able to read it without looking basically anything up and have understood the vast majority of it. When something is a little above your level, you could still probably read all of it and probably not have to look anything up, because you're letting your brain do all this subconscious pattern recognition. And if you do that in high volume, you will start to build understanding. But sometimes you have a lapse in understanding of the source material. So it is okay to look some stuff up. But I would say if you have to do that, do it quickly. Have a dictionary on your phone or something like that. Look up the term that you need and move on. Don't worry about understanding it perfectly, word for word, every bit of grammar. It's not worth your time. And especially as a beginner, it's really not worth your time. And it's probably more disruptive to your learning than it is helpful. If you're reading something especially complex and you feel like you have to keep looking things up over and over again, that's probably too hard for you, and you need to step down a level and maybe return to that thing that you're trying to read later on once you've built up some more vocab and understanding. Listening is a lot more straightforward. For listening, we need to listen a lot and listen often. And yes, we still need good materials. We still want things that are close to us, but just outside of our reach, so that we can go acquiring new things, building on the base that is always growing. The thing with listening, though, is that you really have to learn to be comfortable with the unknown. When you're listening to a podcast, TV show, or a movie, or even say you're traveling and you're listening to other people, whether they're talking to you or you're listening to other people talk in the street or in a restaurant, whatever, don't eavesdrop too much, weirdos. But anyway, those things are not written on a page for you, and you can't pause live listening. You can pause some videos and go back and listen again. That's cool. But you don't always want to do that. So there's going to be a lot of things that you hear, you won't recognize, and you might sort of have a gap in your understanding there. You have to be okay with that. It's going to happen a lot, and you're going to say, that's fine. I'll listen out for the next few things. Maybe I will understand those, and then I can move on. All right, reading and listening together. If one of your skills is really lagging, reading or listening, then you might not be ready to do them at the same time. But depending how easy that material is, sometimes it's a good way to build that. If you get a really, really easy book, I know some websites have free graded readers that also come with audio. That's great, but this is really accessible with like audiobooks plus a physical book, reading subtitles on movies and TV shows if the subtitles match up, which I mentioned in the using TV shows and movies for language learning guide, that subtitles don't always match up. Sometimes the language is a little bit different, but it's still an option. Lastly, once you have a base level in both of these things, then it's up to you to prioritize. Which thing do you really need to work on more? Which skill are you going to use more? Are you someone who really just wants to be able to chat with people? Like you're going to travel and you want to chat with locals and you're not going to be reading, I don't know, a lot of books and literature. Maybe you don't need to spend as much time on reading. You still need it. It is a crucial part of your language development in your brain, and it will accelerate your learning. If you completely ignore one skill, you're going to hinder the other one. So you need a base in both, but you can prioritize at a point and say, you know, I really just want to get amazing at listening, then learn the basics of reading, build some fluency and proficiency, but then prioritize the listening. Here's some example materials for reading and listening. So for reading, obviously I have books. I hope that was on your list already. Graphic novels are amazing. Please use them. News articles, all of these, of course, they have to be appropriate to your proficiency level. Blogs, social media, Twitch. I say Twitch and reading because I will be honest with you, when I have gone to watch French or Spanish streams sometimes, or Italian stuff, I have absolutely learned new language from chatting with people in the text chat on Twitch or reading what they're saying to each other. I have absolutely acquired language from that. I know that one's a bit specific, but if you're somebody who likes watching streams, it is not a resource to be slept on, even for reading. Video games. Just quick note here on the video games. Not all of these are made equal for language acquisition. If you have like a single player game or a narrative driven game with a lot of story and a lot of text, yeah, the reading actually can be very helpful. I've been using that to acquire Japanese myself. If it's something where there's not a whole lot of talking or reading and stuff going on, well, obviously you're not going to gain as much. So use your judgment. And as I mentioned earlier, this could be subtitles of listening materials, depending on what's available. On listening, we have YouTube. Of course, hello, we're here right now. You have podcasts. There are an abundance of language learning podcasts in lots of different languages. Please use them. And things like podcasts and audiobooks that you don't even have to have the visual part for, or there is no visual, you can use those all the time. Use them when you're in the car. Use them when you're around the house doing chores. Get the listening in as much as you can. We got vlogs, audiobooks, TV shows, movies. I already mentioned it, but I already have a guide on using TV shows and movies for language acquisition. So I'll put that up here. Please check that out. Then Twitch, if you like live streaming, you're interested in that. I've used Twitch lots of times for reading and listening practice and just interacting with native speakers of a language. And it's a really cool experience. And lastly, video games for listening. Sometimes some games will have voiced lines. So they'll have the text and they'll have voice actors actually reading through everything. That can be helpful too, but I find that that's less likely than just having a game with lots of text. Okay, on to output. All right, that's it for part 1. Make sure you stay tuned for part 2. It is coming very, very soon. In part 2, we'll cover output strategies in fluency. That is, we'll go over writing and speaking practices, some example practice opportunities for each, and we'll be covering how to prioritize and spend your study time. That includes a breakdown and differentiations by proficiency level. So don't miss it. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you leave any questions you have down below in the comments, and I will see you then.